All right. This is going to be a, excuse me, lecture on the 3-day blow, or a close reading of the 3-day blow. And I'm sorry about my voice. I have strep throat. Hopefully you guys can hear me all right. And I'm going to go ahead and start right now just because um, this video is for some of y'all that missed the lecture. Decided to just do a video because you do need to know kind of an analysis of this particular short story if you're going to be doing the essay prompts. So I'm sorry, this is the end of something, not the 3-day. Excuse me. Right now I'm assuming that you guys have already read the short story, and I'm going to share my screen here. Like looking stuff like this. Okay. All right. So, one of the first things, or you should be paying attention to once you're ready, once you've read the stories that you want to go in and do, is either decide what if you're going to want to talk about the elements of fiction, or if you're going to want to talk about literary devices within Hemingway's work. And again, this one would be prompt number 2 if you're going to be using this PDF, and this would be prompt number 1. And prompt number 3 deals with contextual elements, which means like his history, his influences, and things like that. For primarily what I'm going to be doing for this one, because Indian Camp, we really kind of just talked about fiction, the elements of fiction. We talked about setting and all that. While I will maybe mention some things with regards to this, I'm primarily going to be focusing on literary devices for the short story. All right. So again, I'm assuming that you guys have read the story, and pretty much, if you read it, we have Nick again coming out in this story, and we're introduced to a couple of other characters. Primarily, the protagonist again is Nick, character-wise, and you have Marjorie also. And Marjorie, exposition and plot-wise, starts off in Hortons Bay, and Hortons Bay is in Michigan, and it's a lumbering town that's deserted. And 10 years later, then we're introduced to Nick and Marjorie fishing around the bay, I guess, around the river there. And so pretty much they're fishing, and they get into a little like, I guess, like discussion or fight, and at the very end, Marjorie leaves. She takes off, and she leaves Nick there, and then another character, Bill, comes out at the very end, is asking Nick, is everything all right? And it kind of ends like that, pretty much. And again, this is part of Hemingway's, iceberg theory. It's, it seems like a pretty simple storyline. Then we're going to get into the subtleness of the story and kind of reading in between, and finding out the extra kind of whatever is underneath the iceberg now. Now, before I start talking about the story itself, before there is a chapter 3, there's a little vignette, and you can see that. It's a little blurry. I know. There's a little vignette at the beginning of this, originally published in our time. the first 49 includes this. So, excuse me. A lot of the times these vignettes have really nothing to do with the actual story, but in some cases, and this time around, it actually does. So here, the chapter begins like as is. So I'll go ahead and read it. We were in a garden at Mons. Young Buckley came in with his patrol from across the river. The first German I saw climbed up over the garden wall. We waited till he got one leg over and then potted him. He had so much equipment on and looked awfully surprised and fell down into the garden. Then 3 more came over further down the wall. We shot them. They all came just like that. So again, this is like a little vignette, a little scene of, Germans crossing over a wall or scaling a wall. And then at the other end, you have, I guess, the British soldiers or snipering them, and each one of them, pretty much are picked off and are killed. So I'll come back to this a little bit later just to kind of see how it's related or interrelated with the story. But again, the story starts off in Gordon's Bay. It's deserted 10 years later. And then the dialogue begins with Nick and Marjorie. And with the story, you really have to pay attention to individual words to make light of what's going on. So what I'll do first is I want to talk about one of these literary terms. Let me see if I can find it here. What they'd be in alphabetical order, but and this one may not include all of them too. I mean, it has a lot of literary terms and devices that generally appear in fiction or poetry, but it might not have all. I am missing the one. So let's look for the one that I'm talking about right now. And it's personification. The attribution of personal nature, human characteristics to human, non-human, and the representation of an abstract quality in human form. So at the very beginning, there's some stuff that's personified here. First, I want to pay attention to a double meaning here at the very beginning. And again, that's another literary device. There's our old ruin, Nick, Marjorie said. Nick's rowing looked at the white stone and looked at the trees, and he says, there it is. Can you remember when it was a mill? Marjorie asked, and Nick's like, I could just remember, Nick said. And it seems more like a castle, Marjorie said. So right at the beginning, we're a little bit privy into the relationship with Nick and Marjorie, and they're fishing, but Marjorie is sort of remembering stuff. She's saying, look, there's our old ruin, and by ruin in the context in which it's being used, it's like there's our old stomping ground, right? Later on, we're gonna again come back to this and be how it sort of changes a little. And then she says it seems more like a castle, Marjorie said. Nick didn't say anything, so they just rode out of sight of the mill. Nick cut across the bay. So then we get into some scenes with them fishing, and so apparently they're fishing, and all of these fish around the river are biting, but they're not striking the actual, like they're not taking the bait, right? And she says they aren't, or Nick says they aren't striking. He said, no, Marjorie said. She was intent on the rod all the time. They trolled even when she talked. She loved to fish. She loved to fish with Nick. Close behind the boat, the big mouth trout broke and surfaced out of the water. Nick pulled hard on one oar of the boat so the boat would turn and the bait spinning far behind would pass where the trout was feeding. They're feeding, Marjorie said, but they won't strike, Nick said. He rowed the boat around to troll past the feeding fish, then headed to the point. Marjorie did not reel until she touched the boat to the shore. So then they pulled up the boat, right? So all of this time, again, they're trying to catch fish, but then the fish are there, but they're not striking. You know, they won't strike. So then they pull up the boat to the beach, and Nick lifted out a pail of live perch or the bait, little perch or little fish. And then Nick caught three of them with his hand and then cut their heads off and used them as bait. Marjorie then goes in and she gets a perch out and cut its head off and then skinned it. Nick looked at her fish and then he's like, you don't want to take the ventral fin out, he said. It'll be all right for bait, but it's better to leave the ventral fin in. So then he hooked each of the perch through the tail. Then Marjorie rows the boat over the channel bank. She's holding the line in her teeth and looking at Nick, who stood in the shore holding a rod, letting the line run out from the reel. That's about right, he called. And Marjorie's like, should I let it drop? She's holding the line in her hand. Sure, let it go. Marjorie dropped the line overboard and watched the baits as they go down the river. So one of the things that I'd like to kind of start off with talking about is a relationship that Nick and Marjorie had. The other thing is we want to also take a close look at maybe how old these characters are. And again, in Indian Camp, if we're talking about Nick being in the same kind of storyline, or in the same kind of, again, in the first 49, one of the things I mentioned is that Nick appears in different stories. So he might be a little bit older in this. I'll kind of leave that up to you to decide how old. But pretty much, again, this is 10 years later after the initial setup for the story. So they have to be at least, again, more than 10 years old, obviously. So it gives you kind of an idea. And the other thing is, again, speaking on the relationship, one of the things that is mentioned in the story is that she loved to fish and she loved to fish with Nick. And it's repeated. With Hemingway, you have to place like careful attention to repetition. Because when Hemingway repeats, he's giving you like a hint for something, right? So another thing is, one of the things I ask my students is, what do you think? Do you think that, she loves to fish. She loves to fish with Nick. This doesn't seem like the first time they've gone out fishing, based on what she said, right? Or based on what kind of is narrated in the story. But it's interesting that, she kind of looks to Nick for approval sometimes, especially at the very kind of end of that part that I read, when he's telling her to leave the ventral fin, and then she's waiting for him to drop it. And she's letting she has a line in her hand, and, it's kind of feeding into his ego a little bit. And it kind of also tells us a little bit about the relationship, that they might be boyfriend and girlfriend, just kind of like, a normal boyfriend or girlfriend, and kind of how you would feed boyfriend or girlfriend's ego too. If you were quite good at basketball yourself or whatever, be like, babe, should I shoot it like this or something like that? And again, just trying to get some sort of acknowledgement or some sort of something like a gesture from your boyfriend, girlfriend. I feel like that's sort of what's going on here when they're fishing, because I think that Marjorie knows how to fish, on her own, because she's getting when she was getting the perch, she did that on her own. She's also maneuvering the boat on her own, and if we go further, you'll see how she kind of gets the boat up on the beach still, right? But it's kind of like playful, and it's the dialogue between both Nick and Marjorie is kind of like if they're young, like they're talking like young kids or something. So then she comes across with a boat and she runs another line. Each time Nick set a heavy slab of driftwood across so that it would hold it propped up. Marjorie rode up the point a little way so she would not disturb the lines. Marjorie stepped out of the boat. Nick pulled the boat high up in the beach. And then Marjorie asked, "What's the matter, Nick?" Nick says, "I don't know." He's getting fire for wood for a fire. They made a fire with driftwood. Marjorie went to the boat and brought a blanket. The evening breeze blew out the smoke toward the point, so Marjorie spread the blanket out between the fire and the lake. Marjorie sat on the blanket with her back to the fire and waited for Nick. So it looks like they're, kind of camping out, putting up the rods, the fishing rods. And it kind of looks like they're getting a picnic together, because she has a blanket, and then later on she unpacks like a basket of supper. So it wasn't like if they're going fishing and then like eating whatever they catch, it looks like they were gonna go for a picnic. Marjorie sat on the blanket with her back to the fire and waited for Nick. He came over and sat down beside her on the blanket. In the back of them was a close second growth timber of the point, and in front was a bay with the mouth of Horton's Creek. It wasn't quite dark. The firelight went as far as the water. They could both see the two steel rods at an angle over the dark water. The fire glinted on the rods. So they're both looking at the rods all the time. And again, Hemingway keeps kind of repeating that, in the story. They're intent on the rods. Earlier, Marjorie is intent on the rod all the time. So that's going to be symbolic in a sense, and we'll come back to that. I never talked about personification though, but why don't we kind of go through these plot exposition points, and we'll talk about that. So they're looking at the rods, and again, they're sort of they're it's like a picnic that they're having, and the scene is sort of set up as this kind of romantic scene already, with the little light, fire and stuff like that. It's kind of romantic, and then the following happens, right? She unpacks the supper. Nick's like, "I don't feel like eating." Says, "Come on and eat, Nick." All right. They ate without talking and watched the two rods and the fire in the water. Again, looking at the rods. "There's going to be a moon tonight," said Nick. He looked across the bay to the hills that were beginning to sharpen against the sky. Beyond the hills, he knew the moon was coming up, right? So, and then Marge says, "I know it," happily. "I know it," Marge said happily. So again, very, very kind of romantic, but you know that with Hemingway stories, if it's going to like romantic, for Hemingway, that doesn't exist, remember? So anytime that you see this optimism kind of happening and stuff, it's gonna be shut down. Then Nick starts picking a fight with her. You know everything. Nick said, "Oh, Nick, please cut it out. Don't be that way." "I can't help it," Nick said. "You do. You know everything. That's the trouble. I've taught you everything. You know you do. What don't you know?" And then Marjorie's like, "Shut up, like shut up. There comes the moon." They sat on the blanket without touching each other and watched the moon rise. "You don't have to talk, silly," Marjorie said. "What's the really the matter?" "I don't know." "Of course you do." "No, I don't." Nick looked at the moon coming up over the hills. Again, the moon is repeated like 3 or 4 times here. Over the hills, too, is another thing that's repeated. It isn't fun anymore. He was afraid to look at Marjorie. Then he looked at her. She sat there with her back toward him. He looked at her back. "It isn't fun anymore. None of it is." She didn't say anything. He went on. "I feel as though everything has gone to hell inside of me. And no, Marge, I don't know what to say." He looked on her back again. He never really looks at her based on kind of what gets repeated there. Then Marge says, "Isn't love any fun?" Marge said. Nick's like, "No." And then she decides to leave. I'm gonna take the boat. You can walk around the point. I'll push the boat out for you. You don't need to. She was afloat on the boat with the water and the moonlight on it. Nick went back and lay down with his face blanket on the fire. You could hear Marjorie rowing on the boat. And she left. All right, here we go. This is where we're going to start with the literary devices that is, they're spread all over the place in this story. The first one is personification, right? And what ends up happening is this kid breaks up with Marge. Nick breaks up with Marge. That's what he does. Ends up doing. And at the very beginning, they're fishing, but this is also a personification of what kind of Nick eventually ends up doing, in the story, which his whole purpose was to break up with her. Right. The problem is that he doesn't do it. Like the fish that are biting, right? There's plenty of fish and stuff like that, and they have their bait out. He won't strike, or they won't strike. So it's a personified, it's personified toward Nick that he won't tell Marjorie flat out, right? He's kind of buying his time in order to do so. At the same time, Marge is sort of romanticizing the whole thing. Her idea of going out fishing with Nick was that she loved to fish with him. She loved is repeated. So to her, they're going on this date, and it's supposed to be romantic, and she even romanticizes it at the very beginning when she says, "There's our old ruin." Now again, ruin has a double meaning, because by the end of this story, the word ruin takes on a different kind of meaning. There's our old ruin, originally our stomping ground, and then there's our old ruin, like the end of the relationship. It's ruin. Right. And then she's like, "It's more like a castle." Again, romanticizing. Castle is like, a reference to the medieval kind of princesses, Knights of the Round Table, and things like that. So again, she is romanticizing the idea of them kind of being there. And Nick doesn't say anything. Just kind of, he kind of ignores her. And also here, she is intent on the rod all the time. Right. So here is another kind of literary device and term that's also symbolism. The rods are also personifying their relationship. Right. It's like if their rods are their relationship, and the lines that are running to the river is their line and their actual relationship, their lifeline. Right? I have a couple of students that came in. You guys want to wait for me real quick outside? Just give me like about 10 minutes. That cool? All right, thank you. She was intent on the rod. Um, and again, to her, it's sort of she's having a good time just being there with him, you know. Even again, feeding into his ego, and she doesn't need it, right? Because she knows how to fish, but she's there because she generally likes to be with Nick. And then and again, kind of skipping forward a little bit, that's when Nick starts picking the fight. Right? They're sitting together in a blanket. Everything's kind of, really, really nice. They're, it's the scene is kind of romantic. And she says, "Come and eat, Nick. Um, come on and eat, Nick," because again, Nick doesn't want to eat. She unpacked the picnic basket with the food, and Nick doesn't want to eat it. She's like, "Come on." So this is where kind of Nick starts kind of pulling the trigger as far as, I'm gonna do what I came here to do. They ate without talking, and they're watching the rods. Again, the rods are their relationship personified. The line is the relationship, and as soon as that line is cut, that's it. There's gonna be a moon tonight, Nick said. He looked across the bay over the hills. Now, I want you to remember the Indian camp when at the very end of the Indian camp, the that imagery appears at the end with the hills and the sun. But this time it's the moon on the hills, like that are coming on the hills. Right? So if the sun is a representation or thematically in the Indian camp as the end, or I'm sorry, a new beginning, then this is the end. The moon is again symbolism for the end. And not only that, the moon is also romantic, right? I mean, and when you see that, automatically you should say Hemingway doesn't want that. Hemingway is trying to, with the war, it has killed all of these things, these old kind of, these old ideologies no longer hold any water anymore, in society. So they're watching the rods, the moon is coming up. Beyond the hills, literally, again, Nick knows the moon is coming up. In other words, the moon is symbolism for the end. So he knows that he's gonna end this. Right? Beyond the hills, the moon's coming up. He knows that he's gonna have to end this relationship. Marge is still kind of set like in her happy ways. I know it, said Marge. She's romanticizing. And then here's where Nick kind of ruins everything. You know everything. So he's picking a fight with her. And then Marge is like, "Look, just shut up, all right? There comes the moon." But they're sitting together, not touching each other and watching the moon rise. She's like, "You don't have to talk, silly." And then she's like, "Well, what's really the matter?" I don't know. So he can't give her like a straight answer. Nick's looking at the moon again. It's repeated like 4 times, coming up over the hills. It's not fun anymore. He was afraid to look at Marsh. Now, this line, starting with "he was afraid to look with Marsh," throughout this whole sort of paragraph, which seems to be like a couple of paragraphs, he never looks at her. He always just looks at her back. Feels how everything has gone to hell inside of me. I don't know, Marsh. He looked on at her back. Isn't love any fun? Marjorie said. No. Then his head isn't. Then his head are on his hands, and then she leaves. So it's like he didn't even have the ability to break up with her, you know, like face to face. He sort of, he sort of did everything behind her back. Right? And then she takes the boat and look at Nick went back to lay down with his face on the blanket. He could hear Marjorie. He lay is repeated like 3 times, so you should look at that. He lay there while he heard Bill come. So lay, and then Bill shows up. Did she go all right? Bill said. Yes, he said, lying. Again, double meaning. In other words, he's lying to Bill. His face is on the blanket. Could also be like lying there. Have a scene? No, there wasn't a scene. How do you feel? Oh, go away, Bill. So the fact that Bill sort of shows up at the very end is kind of weird. It's like, why would he show up? Like, why would he be there and like act all like nonchalant, like if nothing happened? Well, part of the reason maybe you've already figured this out is because this was planned. He had planned to do this. He had planned to break up with Marjorie, and at the end, Bill would come out and whatever. They have like probably their own picnic there at the end. He's checking the rods at the very end, right? And that's it. So it seems, right? Well, what if I were to tell you that at the very beginning, we're told kind of what's going to happen in the story, right? At the very beginning, Horton's Bay, this lumbering town, is deserted, right? So at the very beginning, the whole setting is sort of is foreshadowing. And here we have foreshadowing. It's important hints that an author drops to prepare the reader for what's to come and help the reader anticipate the outcome. So the fact that Horton's Bay was deserted is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the relationship. The end of the relationship. And actually, there's another area where they're sitting down in the blanket when they get to the beach. They're sitting down in the blanket. He came over and sat down beside her on the blanket. In the back of them was the close second growth timber of the point, and in front of them was the bay with the mouth of Horton's Creek. So even when they're sitting next to each other, they're facing Horton's Creek. They're facing that deserted place, that ruin. So that's also a foreshadowing of their relationship, or of the end of their relationship. Right? So again, all of this figurative language is on there. There's so much of it in this story. Right before she leaves, there's narration of her kind of leaving. Nick's gonna push the boat off, and she's like, "No, you don't need to." So then it's described this way. It's written this way. It says, she was afloat in the boat on the water with the moonlight on it. Kind of weird the way that it was written. She's in the boat, in the water with the moonlight. In other words, again, if we're going to say that the moon is representative of the end and also romanticism, she's carrying that with her at the end. She's taking that with her. Right? And all of this is kind of images, and these are all literary terms that are playing an important role in the plot and the exposition of the short story. Now, why did I want to introduce that little chapter at the beginning? Well, the reason I did that is because if you really think about it, the very beginning with that little vignette, they're snipering these Germans that are crossing this wall, right? And whenever you sniper somebody, generally it's a surprise attack. They don't know that you're however far you are from them, and that you're gonna, you essentially, again, in the first chapter is kind of, you're gonna come up on them and shoot them down, right? So in a sense, the beginning of this chapter describes an ambush on some Germans, right? The garden wall, talking about gardens, right? The garden, and the reference, the allusion, right? A reference to a well-known person or place. The allusion in the garden wall is to the Garden of Eden, right? But at the end, it has more of a significance, because essentially at the end, both Bill and Nick ambush Marjorie, because Bill ends up pulling up at the very end of the story and is like, you know, hey, how did it go? So what Hemingway is trying to say with this shorter story is he's offering some um, commentary on a more probably on a more sophisticated, kind of bigger issue, and talking about, again, these old value systems that have been destroyed because of the war, but at the same time offering us a little vignette, a war vignette, that describes this kind of ambush, right? And describes sort of this kind of, again, innocence lost a little bit in the story. So in the Indian camp, there is the theme of life and death, and that Nick sort of experiences life and death. In the end of something, again, Nick experiences a breakup. Nick experiences the first time maybe he was in love. So again, these stories, will build up to sort of say something about the protagonist throughout the first 49 stories, and again provide a little dynamics to the character, because if we see Nick sort of experiencing these coming of age things, right, this thing that's going to make him a man later on, he's going through these experiences so that maybe he changes, or maybe he becomes a more sophisticated character, right? All right, well, that is the end of something. So if you have um, any questions, let me know what's up.